Aloha mai kako! Welcome to the Live Ukulele Podcast. My name is Brad Bordessa, and in this episode, we're going to talk about the very most important thing in music. There's a lot of important stuff, but myself as a teacher, I have to put this at the top, partially and a lot because it's something that is neglected and not done well by a lot of people. So it's something that I'm always trying to bang my drum, teach people how to do this, help them do this, and we're going to talk about it. Before we get started, I'd like to invite you to join me this coming March 23rd, 2024, for anybody listening in the future, at 10 a.m. Hawaii Standard Time. We're going to do a Zoom workshop all about understanding the fretboard. And we'll start with learning the chromatic scale, really basic but really important, and it will allow you to find any note on the ukulele, whether you know the fretboard or not, whether you know where you're starting or not, kind of a thing. If you know the names of the ukulele strings, you can find any note across the fretboard, and we'll do that. We will practice that. I'll show you some examples. And then we're going to dive into some different string transfer shapes, which help you go from one string to the next string and continue on your way playing the chromatic scale or even playing a major scale, which we'll also look at. We will figure out how to build major scales without needing to know the fretboard notes or any major scales. We'll just build it from distances from note to note to note. So we start on a note, build up from there, and continue on our way. So if you are kind of a beginner or intermediate player, you haven't memorized the fretboard, you struggle to understand why notes are in certain places and also in certain places, this is going to be a great opportunity for you. It's an hour-long instructional workshop, and then after that, I will be around for another half hour to take any questions that you might have, make sure that you really can understand what's going on. Once again, that is March 23rd coming up this next week, if you're listening to the podcast right as it's published, at 10 a.m. Hawaii Standard Time. And that ends up being 1 p.m. on the West Coast, 4 p.m. on the East Coast, 8 p.m. if you're in the UK, and it is early morning for our friends in the Down Under and Asia side of things. So tried to choose a time that everybody could feasibly attend. Hopefully it works for you. And if you can't make it, I will be posting the recording the whole workshop and the Q&A and posting that up afterwards. So it will continue to be available, but it would be more fun if you were actually there on the Zoom call with us. So hope you can join. It's $20 for the whole workshop and the Q&A. And I'm also reworking my handout, kind of my one-page handout that has everything you need to know about the fretboard all on one page. It's an easy visual reference with hopefully an even more streamlined workflow. And we'll use that during the workshop to, visualize things and see exactly what's going on. I'm not as fancy as Craig and Sarah. I don't put visuals up on the Zoom screen. Haven't quite gotten there yet with the production values, but I tell you what, the handout is going to be dope. So if you want to join, check out the link in the description below. It's $20. Hope you can be there, and please shoot me an email if you have any questions. So the most important part of music, drum roll, have you seen it coming yet? My regular followers probably already know, but it's timing. And I don't think I've done a timing podcast episode yet, which is kind of funny, kind of ridiculous. Shame on me, because it's really that important. And it's something that the large majority of people can always stand to work on. The large majority of people struggle with it. I will even go so far as to say. Timing is something that you can always improve. You can always make it better, and improving it and making it better is always going to pay off hugely in how your music sounds and comes across. Short of, playing clean notes and making sure that what you do execute on your ukulele is nice and well presented, timing is the next thing that's going to affect how your music comes across. And because so many people struggle with it, and because the ukulele is kind of a casual instrument for a lot of people, as it were, it tends to get neglected. We just go to an ukulele jam and you play the songs and you join the group, and it's just all in good fun. And you don't necessarily need to spend time thinking about your timing and about your rhythmic pocket. And so it's something that often gets skipped. You don't notice that you have a problem until you really have a problem. And somebody like I come along and, we're doing a one-on-one and you're playing something, and maybe it sounds nice to you in the moment and in your head, but for other people listening, the timing is jumping all over the place. You're dropping beats, even dropping bars, and it really makes it difficult to listen to. A lot of people wonder, what's the big fuss about timing? And the way that I like to talk about timing is that it's a kind of universal consensus that if I'm playing a song, I have this understanding with the listener that once the tempo is established and once the timing and the rhythm is established, that it's going to continue to remain that way until I, as the musician, choose to change the time signature or consciously change the tempo. Otherwise, for a whole heck of a lot of Western music, it's just the same tempo all the way through, and everything is played to the same groove in the same pocket. And so that's what you need to strive for. And if you're slowing down or speeding up or you're dropping beats, there's no way for the consensus to continue to be executed consistently. And when there isn't that consistency, it's hard to really engage in the music and hard to certainly dance, but also it's just uncomfortable as the listener to hear that and to know that, well, their timing is kind of all over the place. I can't expect that the next note they're going to play is in the right place. My expectation is completely out the window because it's all arbitrary according to what you're hearing from that player or what I'm playing for you. So it's really important. I would say that a buzzing chord, you can keep going. Most people won't notice. You play the wrong note. If you keep going, most people won't notice. But if you start playing with bad timing, or you never have a groove in the first place, people might not consciously notice, but subconsciously, they're going to be turned away. And instead of hearing you play and oh, that sounds nice, I'm going to go closer and hear what's going on, they're going to nah, it's not my kind of music. Or they're going to come up with some other excuse and maybe they don't realize that it's the timing that's actually pushing them away. I know that for me as a teacher, one of the most painful things to listen to, even above an out-of-tune ukulele or buzzing notes or any other, many multitudes of musical problems that might exist in that moment or in that performance, timing's the one that really makes me grit my teeth and is nails on a chalkboard. I think a lot of people share that, but it's not something that you necessarily realize with your own music. Because in your head, you have an internal clock. Inside you have an internal clock. And it is ticking away with the tempo that you think is happening in the moment. And if you're playing along, you never notice that you're out of time because your internal clock is ticking along and you're following that. Even if your internal clock is jumping around, skipping, that's not something that you're ever going to realize unless you put yourself up against something that is a solid reference. And this could be playing with other people. It could be playing along with the recording, or it's the metronome. I think playing along with other people is a little bit of a false sense of security because what I will do as a musician who has had some experience trying to keep the train from going off the rails with my own musical pursuits, if I'm jamming with somebody and somebody drops a beat or somebody loses the time somewhere, what we do is instead of it depends what you do. Sometimes you will say, okay, I'm staying strong. I know where the rhythm is. I still am feeling it. I'm going to wait until they catch up with me. That's one approach. The other approach is, oh no, we're all lost. We lost the beat. Nobody knows what's happening. You're going to try and find a consensus to get back on track. And so you're not necessarily going to be actively holding the exact tempo. I'm not going to be a stickler in that moment and say like, no, this is the timing, because maybe I don't know. Maybe the drummer dropped a beat and I don't know what's going on. We're all kind of lost. We have to find a consensus. And because we're musicians and we have some experience with this, it's usually pretty easy to get right back on track. But in that moment, you can't reference it as like a perfect time reference. Like if you're the one goofing up and we're trying to follow you, there's only so much of a hard line I can draw. If otherwise, I'm going to be the one forcing the band out of whack because you think your internal time is great. And so a lot of times what I'll do is I will compensate to follow you. And I've gotten really good at that over the years because you end up playing with people with bad timing and you can play as straight as you want, but you're still going to be off from them no matter what because they don't have any idea what's going on. You know, I've played with guys who just drop beats left and right. Like the version of the song they know is completely different from what I know. And you have to compensate for that. You have to figure it out. So a more precise way to match yourself with something is to follow a recording or to use the metronome. And I think as a self-guided musician, somebody who is working towards having that, little bit of extra musicality, the metronome is really your friend. The metronome is the way that you are going to kind of rise above and use that tool to better yourself. I think it's easy to use a recording as a crutch because it's feeding you all this information. It makes it sound good, even if you don't sound good. And you can just go like, oh, I'm a little bit off there, but I'll just catch up and continue on my way because they're holding everything up. But if you start playing with the metronome and you start realizing, why is the metronome speeding up? Or why is the metronome slowing down? I'm like, now I'm backwards of it. You have to learn a number of different things. You have to learn how to get back on track. You have to learn to assess why you got off track in the first place. And you also have to pay attention to like where your beats are. And depending on the metronome, that's not something that is as easy to notice when you like fully just drop a beat and it just disappears. But in general, it's tempo stuff that's going to lead to dropping beats, usually. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get out my metronome and I'm going to demonstrate some things and share what I would do if I was a person who thought, maybe I'll see what my timing is like and realize, oh boy, it's not as good as I thought. How can I fix that? And so I'll share some tricks and tips and work you can put in to try and get a better understanding of this. And this is not like it won't take you a year to improve your timing. If you are kind of blowing your timing in a song, you can spend just a little bit of time on it, understand what's happening, and you'll be in way better shape than you were before. So it's like people think of a metronome as like, a chronic disease or something, and it's bad news the whole way. It's always going to be miserable. And that's not the case. It's something that you're going to struggle with at first, but once you crack the code and figure out what it does, understand what it does, and understand where you fit in relation to it, then it just becomes another tool. It's just like your tuner. You tune every time you play because you want your ukulele to sound its best. You tune into the metronome and assess your tempo against it. You assess your beats against it so that your music can sound its best. Okay, so I have my old Franz metronome. It's a walnut box. You plug it into the wall. It has a mechanical screw gear system in there, something that makes the metronome go along. It's probably not the most accurate metronome in the whole wide world, but it's a heck of a lot better than what most of us can hold internally. And I like this one because it has a little bit of vibe to it. It has a little bit of vibe. And when I turn it on, what we're going to get is a tempo. This is where we're setting the expectation of where the next click is going to be. Okay? And this says 92. I don't know how exactly close it is. Doesn't really matter. But you have this expectation. You're setting the expectation for where that metronome is going to hit the next time. Okay? And so to start, so that you get to a point where your expectation kind of matches your music and what you're playing, you don't need to have an ukulele. This is all internal stuff. You need to figure out how to match this metronome with your body and to understand it physically, right? Because in your head will tell you all kinds of lies. It'll say, like, if you're listening to it, you're like, You can be off as you want, and in your head, it's just going to be like, yeah, you're the man, you're so groovy, you've got the time locked down. But when you make it external, now your ears are hearing two different things next to each other. You're hearing the metronome click, and what I would recommend is clapping. So what you do is you try and clap along with the metronome. It's not as easy as it sounds for most people, especially if you do it for a while. Okay, so here we go. And you try and go for as long as you can, and eventually, if you do it long enough, you're going to start drifting off. And what you need to be able to do when you're drifting off is correct. You need to know, am I slowing down? Am I speeding up? And this might be subconscious. It might be something you learn over time, but that needs to be part of your input. It can't just be, oh, I'm on my clap, I'm doing my thing, because that might be off. You have to have both, and you have to adjust to the metronome. Because the metronome, whether we like it or not, is perfect as far as time goes. Maybe not actually perfect, depending on the kind of metronome you're using, but close enough to perfect that we can use it as our absolute reference. Okay? So if we were to slow down, just for instance, so if we're clapping, okay, I'm pretty locked in right there. But if I start slowing down, it starts sounding like the metronome's going faster. And anytime it sounds like the metronome's going faster, it means I'm slowing down. So what I have to do is speed up. And now I've gone too far. Now I'm clapping faster than the metronome, and it sounds like the metronome's slowing down. So now you fall back and you try and get right on. And this is going to be the kind of thing that you're going to continue to improve and continue to work on forever, as long as you're playing music. This can always get better because this expectation, it's always going to be inherent to the music that you play. And this is part of your feel. It's part of everything that you present. It's built in. And the stronger your expectation is, the stronger you are as a musician, and the easier it is as an audience to relate to that. And I think that it's an easy thing to kind of feel in a band. It's not something you necessarily notice, especially if there's other stuff going on. You know, if you have a band like Kiss, they're all dressed up, they all have face paint. I'm not saying that Kiss had bad timing at all, but there's like other things happening with the band that you might pay attention to more, especially if you're watching a video of them or you're at a concert. You might not notice the timing as much, but you definitely can feel the difference between like high school battle of the bands, where it's all fresh musicians. They haven't been playing super long. You know, maybe they just picked up the guitar last year and like, let's make a band and get chicks or whatever. That is going to be a very different feel because they haven't had time to establish that consensus amongst themselves and also with music as a whole as it's experienced by both the listener and the performer. Whereas if you have an old hat band like Foo Fighters or Santana or somebody who's been playing forever, they've been musicians since forever, then it's just that consensus is so strong. It's right there. All the musicians in the band are at that level. And as a listener, it's so easy to fall into the groove and fall into the consensus of the timing that they're playing. You take it for granted, but it's a thing. It's definitely a thing. And you notice it in old records more so, because old records, you tracked everything live. you worked on tape, you couldn't edit stuff very easy. If you wanted to make an edit, you had to actually, with a razor blade, cut the tape and then tape it back together. And so that made a huge difference in the ability of, in post-production, what could be fixed and what couldn't. If you couldn't play it right at live, there's no reason to think that they're going to fix it in post unless you have a really dedicated engineer, which, not everybody had that kind of time. But nowadays, you listen to stuff on the radio, everything is built on a grid of time, which you could argue is also not so good because it kind of takes the life out of things a little bit. But you can now have any Joe Blow high school kid producing, what sounds like super duper professional high grade music in their bedroom because they can just drag everything onto a grid and everything is always perfectly in time, as opposed to having to play it live as you did back in the old days. Anyways, side rant, kind of a different thing. But what you need to get down, what you need to really have dialed in is just this simple clapping and being able to adjust as you go so you stay on the metronome. Okay? So next time you do this, and typically when you have a fast tempo, this is 138, right? That's going to be easier to keep steady on because there's less room to be wrong. Whereas if I slow way down, there's a lot more space between the clicks, and therefore I have to be a lot more precise to sound like I'm still on time. When you have a fast tempo, you can be sloppy and you don't need to be quite as precise. That's why a lot of people will tell me like, oh, but I can play it fast. And the reason you can play it fast is because you're muddling through. But you don't truly understand the timing of a song, or perhaps how to play the song at all, in my opinion, if you can't play it as slow as you possibly need to go. Okay, so just for instance, if I take a song and I play it fast, that's fine, but maybe I'm muddling through. If I can't also play that very slowly, my timing isn't actually that good, because all you're doing when you change the tempo is you're scaling everything. It all slides. Everything's the same distance from each other relatively, but what you're doing is you're expanding the whole timeline. You're just stretching it out like a slinky. If you had a perfect slinky that everything was always even, when it was together, all the rings would be close. They would all be the same distance from each other. But when you stretched it out, they'd be spaced further out, but they would still, each one along the line would be the same distance from the next one along the line. That's how you can think of timing. And so all you're doing when you're slowing things down is stretching it out. You're playing the same exact thing. You're just playing at a different tempo, and you should be able to do that. That is a great thing to practice. It's a good way to improve a song that you're working on, but also to prove that you actually do know it. It's very easy to muddle through and think you've got it. Like, I can play it. It sounds fine when I play it fast or I play it at performance tempo. But there's actually a lot of room for improvement that you will learn and you will uncover if you take the tempo and you scale it way back. I always say, play it slow enough that you're bored. If you can play it in time, everything lined up in the right spots, at a place where you are actually bored with playing the song, then you know you're doing it right. Because when you're bored and you're playing it that slow, you have all the time in the world to get to the notes, to make your shifts. There's so much time to pay attention to other things. Once you can do the timing and you're bored with the timing, then you can think about how you're transitioning between the notes. You can think about your muting. You can think about fretting and, that nice happy 2/3 up the fret hand position, finger position. Playing slowly like this is one of the most powerful and underused tools that a musician has, I think. Another thing to keep in mind is that you want to be able to practice at different tempos. If you always practice everything at the same exact tempo, maybe you choose 100 because it's a nice round number, and you clap, you're going to only get used to this tempo. That's it. But you want to practice kind of all the different stops. This is a little faster. This is 120. You want to also be able to feel that accurately. You want to be able to go, rarely will you go this fast, but if I need to, I can. And especially slow, you have to really focus on where your expectation is. And it's easy to drift. But when you drift and you're going slowly, it's easy to notice whether you're going faster or slower and to compensate. And so I like clapping and playing at slow tempos because it gives you the opportunity to notice what's actually happening. And then you can correct it. And it's not like you get on the train and you're good to go. Timing is all about continual correction. That's all you're ever doing is correcting when you're with your timing. I mean, ideally you'd kind of get beyond that and you're just like in the pocket, in the groove, and you're golden. But a lot of times, especially when you're really focusing on the timing and you're focusing on playing along with the metronome, then it's something that you're always adjusting to. Oh, the metronome's getting faster, I must be slowing down. Oh, the metronome's getting slower, I must be speeding up. And you constantly, it's like when you go to the bowling alley and they bring out the bumpers for the kids and they roll the ball down the lane and it bounces off the bumpers on the side all the way down. That's all you're trying to do with the metronome, is you're trying to stay in the middle as best you can, but sometimes you drift and sometimes you bump. Oh, got to go back the other way. Oh, bump. And you're just kind of weaving your way through the music, through the timing to find that ideal time. Because, I mean, as much as we might like to think that we're great musicians or whatever, you just won't get that accurate with a metronome. There's going to always be the human element of our perception of time is really weird. And so you're only never going to be able to get so precise. So even if you're a really good musician, it's like the you move the bumpers on the bowling lane, instead of it being all the way at the gutters where it normally is. Maybe if you're a beginner musician, the better you get, the further in those bumpers come, so that the ball only moves back and forth just a little bit as it goes. It goes almost in a perfectly straight line. And what you do as you practice is you try and get your bumpers to be as close as possible, so that the ball and the music goes in a straight line, bang down the middle. Your timing doesn't waver that much. That's the goal. So something that a lot of people ask, and seems like kind of is shrouded in mystery, is like, how do I play a song with the metronome? How do I put it with the metronome? And this is such a weird question. And I think I've talked about this with my brother before, he's not really a musician. He's played a little bit in his youth, and I think he could pick up an ukulele and strum some chords and play a song or two. But he's not really a musician. But I asked him, like, how do you teach timing? Just as, like driving in the car, like, how do you teach timing? I'm trying to figure out how you teach people timing. And he thinks about it because he's a big music enthusiast. He loves to listen to his music, and, he's always got tunes on while he's working on his car or whatever. But he was like, I don't know. That's so interesting. Like, how do you teach timing? And it's tricky because I think that it becomes like anybody can clap along to the metronome. That's very straightforward. But how do you go from that to a preset rhythm from a song and link the two together if you have no idea of what that should be? Right? Barring the fact that maybe there's sheet music to help you out or whatever. It's something that you kind of intuitively have to make a little bit of the jump and understand that along the way, okay, we have beats. Okay, and usually 9 times out of 10, the metronome is set to be the beat. Okay, so when I turn on the metronome, beat, 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 beat. And what you'll usually do is you count along with it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And that is your count throughout the song. That's the beat of the song. That's pretty straightforward. But what gets tricky is when you start adding rhythmic divisions, because this is where it will start. If you don't have an intuitive sense of timing, this is where it will start to feel just arbitrary. It's like, oh, they're just choosing something different, and I don't know how to understand that. And this is the jump that you kind of have to make on your own a little bit. But if you turn on the metronome, and that's our beat, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. If you double that, the metronome stays the same, but what you're thinking and feeling inside of you is twice that. Then you get eighth notes. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. This is a super important thing to practice as well, because if you can't take your time from feeling quarter notes to feeling eighth notes, you're going to have a really hard time with rhythm, because there's very few songs that are just quarter notes. You really do need the eighth notes at very least, you need eighth notes to kind of navigate the world of music. And even then, you're going to need to do a little bit more work beyond that. But as far as relating with a metronome, let's go back to Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star with the metronome. And what I want to show you is two different ways of feeling the beat. And this will help you hopefully understand kind of how eighth notes sit. What we're also going to need is a half note. And a half note is easy. It's just 2 quarter notes. You just hold for 1, 2. 1, 2. That's your hold for a half note. And we have one of those in Twinkle, Twinkle. So if I start playing through that, I'll call out the note duration. So if we go here, we go quarter, 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 half note, quarter, 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 half note. That's the rhythmic pattern of what's happening inside of that song, right? You have quarter notes and you have a half note. So you can't just go on autopilot and just be beat, beat, beat. That's not going to be helpful. You got to actually pay attention to when things change, when the shift happens. But if you were to take that and double that on top of the metronome, so that now your quarter notes become eighth notes and your half notes become quarter notes, you have a song that is twice as fast, but you're also forced to think about the difference between eighth notes and quarter notes. So just using this example, it could be good practice to just kind of understand the difference. So the first thing you do is like, okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So eighth note, eighth note, eighth note, quarter, eighth note, eighth note, quarter. So all I've done is shrink the slinky. Now all of the rings are the same distance from each other. The ratio is the same between them, but the tempo is way faster and the time between the notes is actually less. Okay, so those are both at the same tempo. So if you can practice going between those, you're going to really get a sense of what is happening between quarters and eighth notes, right? Just by dividing everything in half or doubling it. So if we go back to quarters, half note, half note, quarter, quarter. That would be a really good exercise. That's at 96 according to the old Franz. It's probably not exactly that. But somewhere in, if you were like 90 or maybe 80, you got to always choose a tempo on your metronome that allows you to play the fastest you're going to need to play. One of the worst mistakes I see people make is they're like, oh, I know this part of the song, I'm going to play it at this tempo. And then when they get to the hard part that they're not as comfortable with, they slow down. And when you slow down, you're expanding the slinky and you're no longer matching that expectation that we've had for the whole rest of the song. Now we've slowed down and I don't know where you're going from here. Because if you go back to the old part of the song that you know and you can play fast and you go faster again, you've broken that expectation twice now. So you want to set your tempo to something that will allow you to play the fastest part of the song. So obviously in this case, it's the eighth notes for the Twinkle Twinkle. So you want to set the tempo to something that you can achieve that speed at, and then you force yourself to play the rest of it painfully slowly. Okay, so for instance, if I go down to 80, my eighth note is going to be 2, 3, and 4, and... And if that's still too fast, and you go down to 60, gotta compensate. Now that second part becomes a lot of waiting, but I have to play the eighth note part slow enough that I can achieve it. If I can't achieve it, I don't want to change the time. I don't want to change tempos within the song unless it's part of the song. Some pieces you do have tempo changes. It's kind of rare with the kind of stuff that most ukulele players play. You know, even like great ukulele players rarely will actually change tempo bang in the middle of a song. That's more of like a band kind of thing, I guess. So start with simple melodies. If you're not sure how to play with a metronome, don't jump in and try and put your rendition of some Jake song along with the metronome. You're just going to crash and burn. It's going to be frustrating. You need to understand what is happening. You need to know exactly where everything's supposed to go, and you have to feel it. Otherwise, you're kind of wasting your time. So play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. If you don't know it, figure it out by ear. Go rewind the podcast, figure it out. It's not that hard. Most people can do it if they kind of believe in themselves. And then play that with the metronome, and you know I've already given you the information that it's quarter, 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 half note, and you can count it according to a metronome. Put the metronome where you need it to be in order to play that. Then you can practice going from everything being once per beat, which is essentially clapping, right? Like you've done before. You're just transferring that clapping onto the ukulele, plus you have the 1/2 or the 2 half notes you have to keep track of, so that you go back to the normal quarter note beat at the right time. It's not arbitrary. We're not guessing here. This is all a mathematical division of rhythm. And so if you have a half note, you go 1, 2, bang. The next note is right there. 1, 2, bang. That's where the following note after the half note is always going to be. It's always going to be on that third beat after. That is just the nature of the half note. Just like after you play a quarter note, bang, bang, you're going to have the next quarter note is going to be after, or the next whatever note is going to be after. It's just all about holding up that time and being accountable for the consensus of what is happening. A lot of times, this is something I haven't touched on yet. The biggest place where people tend to drop beats and thereby skew the consensus of time is where there's spaces in music, because people are afraid of leaving holes and not playing. They're afraid of playing, but they're more afraid of not playing. It's kind of funny when you finally get somebody to like, oh, come on, play me a song. And like, no pressure. I don't care. Whatever. Play me a song. They like play and they get playing. And then when they stop playing, they rush through it so they can go back to playing, which originally they were nervous about. Anyways, the gaps are where people tend to rush. So what you need to do, this is a great reason to play with the metronome. Like, for instance, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. What you don't want to do is twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I want. You don't cut it off because you want to go to the next part. That's not the song anymore. You need to be accountable for whatever the little bit of rest is or the hold. And what I like to do is count in those places. So if I'm feeling the beat, dun, 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 2, dun, 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 2, bang, is where my next note would go. So you just have to be mindful of it, and you might have to count a little bit. The ukulele doesn't have super good sustain, so you can't really lean into holding notes as much as you could with like a bass guitar or an electric guitar or a piano or some other instrument where you plonk on a note and it just kind of stays there until you stop it. You can hold 2 whole notes and it's no problem. It just keeps going. But with the ukulele, the notes fade out so fast, you kind of have to just believe in that space there, and you have to count it in your head or count it out loud. I like forcing people to count it out loud because I think it makes them more accountable and it makes them actually hold the time. Because then your voice takes the place of the ukulele and you're still thinking about something in that musical space. You've just ceased playing on the ukulele and now you're playing on your voice, if that kind of makes sense. And so when you have gaps, you've got to count. I had a student and we were working on Uanoho Awa Kupa out of my Hawaiian Songs for Ukulele course. And it's a really beautiful melody. But you have some long holds. And she was struggling to kind of give them the proper space that they needed. So I forced her. It's like, okay, so when you get to those places, you have to count. Sorry, we're not negotiating here. I, as the teacher, I'm telling you, count, damn it. You need to be accountable for those spaces. 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4. Usually I won't count when I play on the note because playing gives me something in that space. But when I'm holding across a bunch of beats, then that's where I will count out loud. And so you kind of have to feel the pulse. You have to know what's going on. That might be a nice tempo for this song. Two, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. That beat there, if you have to reference that, that's fine. Just get yourself on track and, scale everything accordingly. I did not tell my student, count, damn it. But I think it's funny because it's so true. It's one of those things where you have to, as the teacher, you have to stand your ground and say no, I really need you to count so that you can do this. I know you can do it if you just count out loud. So it's one of those things where sometimes you got to make it obvious. Sometimes people are like, I can count it in my head or I can just feel it or whatever. And it's like, no, it's obviously not working. So you got to try something different and that's fine. But sometimes as the teacher, you got to point that kind of thing out. But yeah, when you have a space, unless you really know unless you really know that you're doing it right, which, at a certain point, maybe you will. You can know this by recording yourself and listening back. But until that point, there's no harm in counting. At least count in your head to hold up the spaces so that you know where you're coming back in. Because if you don't count at all and you're just guessing, you don't have any feel for the beat, you are literally just guessing. And it doesn't work ever. Unless you're really lucky. Sometimes you'll get lucky. But it's not a guess and I guessed right because I'm a good musician kind of thing. Good musicians are not going to guess on that. They don't need to because the beat is always going in your head or you count in the spaces or whatever it is. You're feeling the music in the correct way, in relation to the metronome and in relation to everything else. The music, the expectation of the time that you have with the listener, all of that kind of stuff. I'll make one last point. In case there's anybody out there who's super lost with any of this, this should probably go in the beginning, but I'll put it back here. Is that almost all music has a pulse in it. It kind of goes without saying. It's one of those things. That's why it's at the end because I forgot to mention it because it's so straightforward to me, but it's not something that everybody necessarily understands or just gets. But all music has a pulse. You can put a metronome to all music. You can't necessarily go in afterwards, some old recording and put a metronome with it. Because the musicians might have been drifting. A lot of times in the old days, they didn't play with a click track. You just had to play your part and have good internal timing in order to play the part. So things might speed up, slow down, even the variations in like the tape machines, or if you were listening to a record player, there's mechanical variations in those machines that changes the tempo ever so slightly. That's why if you listen to like an old VHS tape or whatever, it goes rah, 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 rah. That's like a change in the motor speed as it goes around. So those aren't necessarily the kind of place you could put a metronome to after, but in the moment, the musicians were feeling that pulse. Even if they weren't referencing an exact absolute timekeeping device, they were feeling that pulse together. That's always going to be a part of music, is that pulse. It underlies everything. It's always there. And for the most part, as the player, it's non-negotiable. The only time you get to negotiate is when the sheet music has a fermata, the little eyeball looking thing, the eyebrow with the pupil on it. That's a musician's choice moment in timing. And also things like interludes that might be considered in like free time, where you're just kind of riffing and it's a specific part of the song where the musician was probably just improvising and kind of just shredding or going off. I can't think of a whole lot of moments like that. The only one that really comes to mind that I have like in my library of songs that do that is Zap by Eric Johnson. He has like an intro where he's just shredding all over the place. And I remember in the tab book, it said free time, and it wasn't trying to notate exactly where the count was, because at that point in the music, he was kind of just going on his own time before the whole band came in, and then they were all on the same consensus beat. But with very few exceptions, there's always going to be that pulse throughout music. And so what you need to do as the musician is to align yourself to that and build your ability to align yourself to it better and more consistently throughout music, throughout different tempos, throughout different rhythm feels, throughout different styles of music, throughout different instruments, throughout singing as well, throughout playing with people. It's all part of just building that confidence with the timing and building the consensus so your listeners can dance. That's really important. They're not going to dance if the timing sucks. They're just not. All right. I feel like there is certainly enough material left in my bag that I could do a part 2 of this timing podcast. If you think that would be awesome, shoot me an email, or if you're a member of one of my ebooks or courses, throw up a thread on the forum and we can discuss it there and answer any questions and also kind of gauge the enthusiasm. Yeah. Okay, so thanks so much for listening. Once again, my name is Brad Bordessa. If you are on Facebook, I made a Facebook page for Live Ukulele the other day and have been working on putting up some different stuff. There's a few little video lessons I've thrown up there so far. Give it a follow, like, share some stuff, whatever. You know how that all works. That would be great to connect with you folks over there as well. And as always, if you like the podcast, please subscribe. Join my newsletter on liveukulele.com. And if you want to support my work here with the podcast and all the free resources that I provide on Live Ukulele, then go check out one of my ebooks or video courses. It's a great way to learn some awesome new stuff and also to help me pay my bills. And we'll keep this thing going as long as we can. Keep making some music. I'll catch you all down the road. Be well out there. Keep on jamming. Hui ho.